All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first keynote session of eCOTS. I really appreciate everyone being here bright and early on a Monday, especially those of you who are with Dash and I at the AP reading, who got home and just got right back on a computer for more time. So I'm Kelly Spoon. I'm on the organizing committee for eCOTS and will be serving as a moderator for this first keynote session. I'm here to help with technical issues and we'll be posting some conference-related announcements in the chat. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dash Young-Saver. While teaching in a Title I school on the south side of San Antonio, Dash threw out his traditional AP Stats curriculum and created lessons on topics that his students cared about: voter power, food deserts, and the Spurs' chance of winning the NBA title, online dating, and more. That year, in a region where 2% of students traditionally passed the AP Stats exam, 42% of his students passed. During the pandemic, Dash put his lessons online. His lessons became Skew the Script, a nonprofit that provides free, relevant, context math questions to over 20,000 teachers and 400,000 students nationwide. In addition to running Skew the Script, Dash still teaches AP Stats part-time in San Antonio and writes math lessons for the New York Times. He holds a BA and a master's in data science from Harvard. All right, it's all yours, Dash.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kelly. And thank you to everyone for allowing me to be here and chat. I really, really appreciate it and super excited to share. So we'll go ahead and share my screen. All right, I'm gonna do the really annoying, just to check, make sure y'all can see my screen. Can y'all see it? Yes, no. Great. All right, I'm getting chat seeing it. Awesome. Oh, and sorry, I got to unshare to make sure that I'm sharing with my computer noise on. All right. So welcome. If you want to follow along with the links of the presentation, you can go to this tiny URL link. And essentially, I'm going to be sharing out a lot of different resources that we have online. And so if you want to find all those links in one place, this will take you to a Google Doc where it's all compiled together. So you don't have to be furiously writing down links as we go along. This will also be at the bottom of all the slides if you ever get lost along the way and you want to find that tiny URL. So nationally, 60% of students pass the AP statistics exam. However, in the urban core of San Antonio, traditionally that pass rate was only about 2% when I started teaching. And people in education here in the city of San Antonio wondered why this was the case. And to me, as an educator, the answer seemed obvious. I crack open the textbook and start reading out a problem like this one. A factory claims that its batteries can recharge in 60 minutes on average. To test this claim, a statistician gets a random sample of 30 batteries and finds they take an average of 67. And just like that, I'd find students' heads on the desks, bored out of their minds before I even got done reading these problems. And I didn't blame the students. They were mostly coming from low-income backgrounds. They were working jobs outside of school, supporting their family. They had real complex adult problems on their shoulders on a day-to-day basis. And so a lot of the context that we got from the textbook came off as contrived or almost even infantilizing. And I've tried to look for more relevant problems from other textbooks and seen a lot of things like this. On any given day, there's a 10% chance that a citizen of Wakanda required the help of Black Panther. In a full year, how many days would you expect? And again, we'd get the same results. And when I use these sorts of problems, students quickly recognize that they seem contrived, almost like a veneer of relevance on top of a problem where they weren't using the math to dig deeper into something they actually cared about. It felt disingenuous to them, and they could tell that right off the bat. And so one day, really fed up, I went into class and I asked my students, what do y'all actually want to learn about? And they told me they want to learn, do social media creators on average make a livable wage? We talked about that, then made a lesson on confidence intervals. How many people lie in their online dating profiles? Made a lesson on that. We talked about it using probability and expected value. Turns out a lot of people do lie in their online dating profiles. Does income determine access to fresh fruits and vegetables? We talk about that using linear regression. Does my vote really matter? We talk about that in class using sampling distributions. And the year that I went all in, fully into try making every AP stats lesson cover a relevant context, we went from that 2% regional pass rate to 42% passing in my classroom. And note that this is my students' accomplishments, not mine. They're the ones who worked incredibly hard and in large numbers passed the exam, including students who did not pass the exam, worked incredibly hard, learned so much, and got these results. But beyond the numeric results, I found that students were more prepared to use mathematical reasoning as citizens, to look at the complex issues of the world around them and look at all the data being presented to them and think about digging a little bit deeper, think about correlation versus causation, think about bias versus unbiased samples, think about the generalizability of a study. And so they could use those skills to think through very complex issues of the day. And having this experience in class, here's a quote from one of my former students, Julius. I'll give you a second to read through. All right. So, given these results in class, the pandemic happened, March 2020. I spent a few months taking all my materials and putting them in a nice format on a website. And then in June of that year, I decided to launch the website. I called it skewthescript.org. If you don't know the story behind the logo, you'll see that it's a left skew distribution. And the reason behind that is I told my students when I first started teaching AP stats that there was a script written about them. The script is that their scores would be a right skew, that there'd be a lot of low scores and very few high scores. And I told them we're going to skew that script the other direction. We're going to get a lot of high scores and very few low scores. And we're going to prove that script wrong. And so that's the logo you see on the site. And I put all the lessons online and made them freely available for anyone to download and use. Within a few weeks, we had a few thousand teachers signed up. To my amazement, now we have, to my even greater amazement, 20,000 teachers with accounts on the website. We've had over 300,000 lesson downloads, and we've expanded the site now to not only include AP stats, but also Algebra 1 and Algebra 2 lessons as well. All of it trying to situate math in a relevant context and be free to access for any educator across the United States or even the world. And so, given the growth, we decided to incorporate as a 501c3 nonprofit with a mission to provide free, relevant math lessons that boost math engagement and achievement among students from traditionally underserved backgrounds, and that prepare students from all backgrounds to think critically as citizens. So this all, in my mind, begs a question for us as statistics educators. What is the criteria by which we can say that a math or statistics lesson is truly relevant, is relevant to the students we teach in a way that's going to boost that engagement, in a way that's going to boost that investment? And so I've come up with, kind of informally, two relevance criteria in my mind: having a compelling context and having connected content. So a compelling context is a context to the data, to the lesson, that students really, genuinely, authentically care about. So, for example, the textbook problem on batteries, this would not be necessarily a compelling context to most students, because most students don't really care about the mean recharge time of household batteries. They don't care about that at baseline. And as you go through the problem, that context is not coming alive. The other criteria is to have connected content, where the math you're doing or the statistics you're doing meaningfully connects with the context and enhances or gives new insight into the context. So that quote unquote relevant textbook problem I showed before, this, I would argue, is not necessarily connected content. solving this problem won't give students new, meaningful connections to the character of the Black Panther. And even for students who love the Black Panther, this problem doesn't really give them any new, genuine insight or appreciation for the character or storylines that they've grown to love. It almost feels like the math or statistical thinking here is an add-on, which makes this feel like an irrelevant veneer on top of what could be an irrelevant problem. And so it feels disingenuous to students. So how can we meet the relevance criteria of both having a compelling context and having meaningfully connected content to that context? Well, I have 4 strategies I want to share today in order to meet that relevance criteria in our classes. And those are situating our lessons in civics, storytelling, surprise, and community. So let's start with a first example in the area of civics. And this example happens to be lesson 6.1 on the Skew Script website. And again, all the materials are free to access and download. So if you want to get the fuller version of this lesson rather than the little snippet I'm going to show you here, feel free to go to the link right here. And again, at the bottom, you'll see the tiny URL to all the links that you'll see over the course of this session. So I actually happen to have it pulled up. So I'm going to go to that lesson right now. And here's where it exists on the site. And if you look at the PDF handout that you can download, you'll see that it's a 3-page lesson where they're going through and discussing the topic of gerrymandering. And we start them off with a video explainer of what gerrymandering is, how it works, how it could lead to disproportional representation, the history of gerrymandering. And then the final part of this quick explainer video talks about Texas's 35th district. This happens to be the district in which me and my students live, and you'll see that it connects the south and east sides of San Antonio with the east side of Austin. And our question is, why is it doing this? And why are we not having a district that represents, say, the city of San Antonio rather than this kind of linear district that tries to connect the east side of 2 cities? Where does this come from? Is this representative of how people feel? And then they hand out links here where they go through the simulation and they do their own sort of gerrymandering, and they see what you can do to try and make different districts have different beliefs. But then we get to what really is the meat of the lesson statistically. After they get their hands wet with gerrymandering, they get to use this applet that we built on top of an amazing package from the Alarm Redistrict group, which I believe is out of Harvard. And we kind of took their R package and put this applet wrapper on it to make it more usable for students who might not know programming. So I'm going to start off, as the lesson does, with the state of Oregon. So here is the state of Oregon. Oregon has 6 electoral districts. And as of the 2020 census, here was the map of Oregon's districts. You can see that 5 lean Democrat, 1 leans Republican. And the question is this a usual map of Oregon? Is this one that you might naturally see if you were nonpartisanly drawing the lines? Or is this a gerrymander map of Oregon? Is this an unusual map of Oregon compared to what you might see by chance? And so what this package does that we built the applet on top of is it takes Oregon and, using a couple rules like no incredibly weird shapes and random sampling, it randomly redistributes the lines of the districts, and it uses prior voting data to see what the partisan lean would be in those new districts. So I'm going to go do 1 random resample of the state of Oregon. So you can see that in this random resample of the state of Oregon, there were 3 Democrat-leaning districts and 3 Republican-leaning districts. The axis here is the number of Democrat-leaning districts. So we have 1 simulation that results in 3 Democrat-leaning districts. And recall that the actual number in the actual map is 5. And so I can do another one. And we can see here that's another 3. I can go ahead and do 3 random resamples. And now we're starting to build up a distribution where, among my random resamples, 4 times I get 3 Democrat-leaning districts. 1 time I got 4, 0 times I got 5. And we can go ahead and do 100. So here is 100 resamples of the state of Oregon. And we can see here that out of approximately 105 times that we run the simulation, only 3 times did we see as many Democrat-leaning districts as 5, as what we see in the actual map? And so students will start to invent things, invent these themes of inference that we then cover through the rest of the course. 3 out of 105, that's pretty unusual. 3 out of 105, that's like a 2%, maybe something like 2-3% p-value. They wouldn't call it a p-value yet, but that's a very small proportion of maps that are that extreme. It might be unlikely to see a map this extreme by chance alone. Maybe I should reject this map. And all of a sudden, you're getting students inventing the idea of a p-value, inventing the idea of rejecting a null hypothesis without knowing even the vocabulary yet. And by building simulation and this intuition, we are setting the stage for inference in the course, and we're giving students a genuine insight into the topic of gerrymandering that if you hadn't explored it through simulation, it might otherwise be incredibly complicated, but through this is made a bit simpler and also gives you an idea of what could be done to evaluate maps in a nonpartisan way. This one, we say, well, we have some evidence that this might be gerrymandered by the Democrat legislature in Oregon, because this is an unusually high number of Democrat-leaning districts. Now, of course, we don't stop at Oregon. We go to my home state, for example. My home state is Texas, and it's going to take a little bit longer to load because Texas has far more districts than the state of Oregon. But as you may know, Texas has a Republican legislature. And so the question is, has that legislature done a good job at doing its redistricting in a nonpartisan way, or might it be gerrymandered? And I'm going to go ahead and do 100 resamples of the state of Texas. And you can see now that when I do that, the actual number of Democrat-leaning districts was 14. But when I do simulations, we tend to get a higher number of Democrat-leaning districts. We get maybe 17, usually with a little bit of variation. There are very few maps that have 14 or fewer Democrat-leaning districts. So this would be unusual the other direction. This is some evidence of Republican gerrymandering. And you can see here again, this in the actual map, thin blue line connecting the east side of Austin, the south and east of San Antonio. And that's again where I and my students live. And then you can look at a state like Virginia. Virginia had a lot of bickering about their redistricting in 2020. And so the state Supreme Court stepped in and said, okay, legislature, we're taking over. You're not allowed to draw your own map anymore. We're going to draw the map for you. And when the Supreme Court did that, we can evaluate the results. And you can see that the actual number of Democrat-leaning districts, 7, fits pretty much square in the middle of the simulated sampling distribution, as I'm calling it, of all the possible maps of Virginia that you might see from random selection. And so this would say, well, this map is unusual. I would not reject this map. So this is a way to get students really engaged in the idea of the civic issue of gerrymandering, while also introducing a statistical method through randomization distributions that is going to help them later in the course, but also help them really get more in depth into this context. In terms of compelling context, what I've found is that civic topics involve really engaging discussions of power, fairness, and how we organize society, which tend to be really compelling for students no matter where they're coming from. And the topic of gerrymandering itself might not be at baseline something students really care about, but once you show them a video explaining it, once you show them what their own district looks like, once you show them how voter power may be distorted, students get engaged because it's something that will affect them or will affect their peers. And we have connected content here. This lesson sets the stage for inference and gives students new insight in the problem of gerrymandering in a way that if you had not done this math, if you had not done simulated distributions, if you had not, and so it's really meaningfully connected content. By the way, when approaching civic issues, especially at the high school level, we like to make sure that we're out in front of telling parents, hey, our stuff is made in a nonpartisan way. We have a teacher review committee from all political leanings reviewing the lessons to make sure it's nonpartisan and very data forward. And so we have on our website a letter to parents that one can send to let them know of that, as well as to admin and also to students, letting them know that, hey, we're going to do this in as nonpartisan way as possible. We're not going to shy away from certain topics necessarily if there is a good statistical investigation to be had, but we're going to do so in the fairest way. And we also have a set of discussion norms available on the website that we found is really useful for setting good norms with students about talking about these sorts of civic issues in a way that leads to respect, but also really rich discussion for all. So again, that's lesson 6.1 on the site if you want to check it out. Another way to meet the relevance criteria I found is through the use of storytelling. So note that inspiration for the use of storytelling and statistics is taken from a couple colleagues I really admire, Ji-sun and Mahmoud Harding. I think they have some sessions that you all should definitely check out here, but they have great work and you should definitely check them out. So my first year of teaching AP Stats, when I started to think about this kind of idea of bringing in real relevance, I thought, what's something relevant that'll get students engaged? And the first thought that came to mind is, well, sports. Kids like sports. Let's talk about sports. And so here's the first sports stats problem that I ever wrote. Star closer, Aroldis Chapman, is one of the fastest throwing pitchers in the major leagues. His fastballs are normally distributed with a mean of 99.6 miles per hour and a standard. And just like that, I got the same results that I've been getting used to from other examples. And I thought, like, why is this happening? Why is it? I thought sports is engaging, right? Why is this happening? Well, I talked to my students. I had 28 in that class. Only 4 of them really like baseball. And of those 4, only 2 knew who Aroldis Chapman really was. And so I decided the following year to take a different approach. I decided to try and tell players stories. So if you want to check out the full lesson materials I'm about to show a snippet of here, this is lesson 2.4 on the website, all again, free to download. So I'm going to tell the story of Jose Fernandez. He grew up in Cuba, where he described playing baseball with sticks and rocks as a child. And after 3 failed attempts, he successfully defected from Cuba to the United States on a boat, where on the last journey, he famously saved his own mother from drowning on the journey. He became the best pitcher, the ace, on the Miami Marlins baseball team. He was known across the MLB for his cheery attitude, and he was wildly popular among the Cuban-American fan base in Miami. Then, unfortunately, on September 25th, 2016, Fernandez died in a boating accident at the age of 24. The very next day, September 26th, his team, the Miami Marlins, had to play the New York Mets in a baseball game. And I'm going to show you a clip that shows the mood at the stadium on that day. And if the sound's not coming through, let me know in the chat.
Difficult day in Miami for Marlins fans, even for Met fans, for baseball fans. Marlins Park. This about 3 hours ago, D. Gordon with Jose's glove and Jose Fernandez cap and a baseball.
I don't know how they're going to do it, but the Miami Marlins are going to play a baseball game against the Mets tonight. I was especially struck by the poignancy of the national anthem, a song we hear every day. But for a young man who risked everything to be a part of this country, it rang especially true today.
Difficult day.
So you can tell, obviously, a very somber mood at the stadium. But by the time the game was over, it would become known as the Marlins Miracle. And that's because of this man, D. Gordon. D. Gordon was one of Fernandez's best friends, and he was the first Miami Marlins batter at that game. And he had not hit a home run all season in over 300 at-bats. He was not a home run hitter. He was a contact hitter. He not hit a home run all season. He was the first one up to the plate. He stepped up, and he did this.
Gordon has started to look like the D. Gordon of last year. Gordon to right. It's deep. And it's gone! D. Gordon has hit it out, and the Marlins have a 1-0 lead.
So that moment, that tearful trot around the bases, became known as the Marlins miracle. And it made headlines across the country for D. Gordon's home run. But there's another potential hero in this story, a hero that may be revealed only through the use of statistics. And that is this guy, Bartolo Colon. He was the pitcher for that game who threw that pitch on the other team, the Mets. And he potentially is an unknown hero in making this miracle moment happen to honor Fernandez. You see, in the first innings of games throughout 2016, if you look at all the fastballs he threw, they're approximately normally distributed in their speeds, with an average speed of about 89 miles per hour, standard deviation of 1.7 miles per hour. Excuse me. And if you look at all the pitches he threw to D. Gordon that season, you'll see, and here's a map of them, that this one, the only one that's right down the middle and the place that's easiest to hit, was the Marlins miracle pitch. And it was only 85.7 miles per hour. And so the question is, do you think Colon purposely threw an easy pitch to help make the Marlins miracle happen? Justify your answer using a normal curve calculation. As you might be able to tell, doing a normal curve calculation for fastball speeds in the first context versus in this one, it hits very differently, and students have very different motivations for wanting to figure out what the probability is. Students get the probability, they find the z-score, use calculator, table A, etc. They find that only 1.5% of Colon's pitches tend to be below 85.7 miles per hour. This was an unusually low speed for Colon, and it's an unusually middle location. So most students will conclude that this pitch was likely purposefully easy to hit. In a post-game interview, Colon was asked if he would purposely threw an easy pitch. He ended the interview early and went home and has never spoken publicly about it since. Out of my class of 30 students the following year in which I did this version of the normal calculation problem, a handful, again, like baseball, but all 30 cared about whether Bartolo Colon's pitch was unusual. And this comes from the power of telling a story. So the compelling context is not necessarily baseball here. It's that we care about stories, very human stories, especially ones that tug at our heartstrings. And it's connected content here because you can only really tell how unusual Colon's pitch was in terms of its speed via those normal curve calculations, which we have to teach in AP Stats. And you have to use those in order to really get a sense of how exactly unusual his pitch was. And so, again, lesson 2.4, if you want to check it out on the website, there's a much fuller version of this online, all available to download. So a third way to meet the relevance criteria is through the element of surprise. So if your students are like mine, some of them will say, well, let me first say, back in my day, and I'm not terribly old, but every year I feel older and older with my students. It used to be, I'm going to drop out of high school or I'm going to drop out of college. I'm going to become a musician, an athlete, or an actor. And students are attracted to these high outlier salaries that they see in this profession, along with the fame that comes with them. But nowadays, my students are like, I'm going to drop out and become a YouTube creator or an Instagram influencer or a TikToker, becoming an influencer that's paid. And so the question of this lesson is, can you actually make a livable wage as a social media influencer? This is lesson 8.1 on our site, talking about influencers and the T confidence interval for a mean. So what I did was I went on YouTube and I collected some data. I essentially went up to the search bar on YouTube and typed in the search query, how much I make on YouTube. And I got thousands of results of people making videos about how much they make on YouTube. And I randomly, among those thousands of results, sampled 35 of them. And I watched a video to find out essentially people screen sharing their backend YouTube data of how much they make on YouTube. And it's pretty reliable data because they screen share their private channel revenue pages in the videos. And so you know that it's real. And you can use what they show to project out how much they make in a year. And so here were the 35 randomly sampled YouTubers and how much they made in a year according to their videos. And you can see on average, they made about $70,000 a year with a standard deviation of 82,000. So if you go through and you make the one sample T confidence interval per mean, we'd say that we're 95% confident that the interval from 41,000 to 98,000 captures the true mean yearly salary of YouTubers, of professional YouTubers. And that's like a pretty livable wage. That's like not bad, right? When we think about how cool it would be to have your profession be making YouTube videos, you might be going for it. But then you have to think about a sanity check here. The sample mean of $70,000. That's quite high. Where does that come from? And so another thing I did was to try and more directly estimate the parameter, the true mean, rather than just going through a sample. I took 2019 YouTube ad revenue, because they're a publicly traded company as part of Google. They have to report their revenue, which was about $15 billion. And they say publicly that for YouTube, creators who are paid by the platform get 55% of all ad revenue generated in the company. And so if you take 55% of 15 billion, you get about 8 billion. So that's the true amount of revenue that went to creators paid by YouTube. And then the number of creators that are paid by YouTube at the time in 2019 was about 18 million. So this is the number of channels where the creators are getting paid by YouTube. And so if you divide those numbers, you get the true average amount of money made by creators per year. That number, when you divide these, is $463. $463 per year. Not a livable wage. And so the question that we get to in this lesson is, after we spent all this time in an AP stats, we check all the conditions, is it a random sample? Did you have a high enough sample size? Did you use the central limit theorem, et cetera, et cetera? You get this confidence interval. We did so much work to get there, and it's so far off. It did not capture the true mean yearly salary at all. And we asked students why. And students will look back at the sampling method. We hope that they do. And they'll see, oh, the way you got your it was a random sample, but it was a random sample among videos that come up from the search query of how much I make on YouTube. Even though the data itself might be reliable, we only sampled among people who choose to make videos about their YouTube incomes. Who are the people who are going to be making videos about their YouTube incomes? People who probably make a decent amount of income on YouTube. People making $5 a year on YouTube are not making videos about how much they make on YouTube. And these people are more likely to have more to brag about. And so even though we got a random sample, it was a random sample among a biased sampling frame. And so our sampling method had bias. And so in this lesson, we get to review the idea of sampling bias along with discuss how to make a confidence interval for a mean. So we had a compelling context, and that context is enriched by having a surprise at the end. It's already an engaging context for students because a lot of them are thinking about, like, can you make a livable wage as a YouTuber, as an influencer, as a creator? But the surprise really enriches this because it creates suspense. And also the content deepens your experience of that context, because the surprise reveals a deeper truth about social media, which is that we tend to see only the successful influencers. We tend to see only the most successful viral videos, which gives us a biased view of the viability of this as a career, because the ones that we're sampling are not a true random sample of all videos on social media, on YouTube, etc. We're sampling among the ones that are popular, and we know that because the popular ones are the ones that people like us are seeing. And so we get a biased view of what the truth is in terms of how hard it might be to make it big on social media. And so by doing this investigation and doing this prize ending, having students really think about bias in the sampling method, you now have a deeper understanding of the market forces at play here in becoming an influencer. And again, this is lesson 8.1 on the site if you want to see the full materials. The last method I'm going to talk about is community, how to reach the relevance criteria through community. So I live in San Antonio, Texas. It's where I teach. And my former student, Linda Saucedo, noticed that her local H-E-B grocery store, and for those who aren't familiar with Texas, H-E-B owns Texas. Not really, but if you want to find a grocery store, H-E-B is essentially the main grocery store we have across the state, and everyone loves them, and they are a great grocery chain. What my student noticed is, we have all these H-E-Bs across the city of San Antonio, is that her local H-E-B location offered fewer organic fruits and vegetables than our location in a wealthier part of town. For example, Alamo Heights, where she happened to visit one time, has a mean income in the zip code in which it's located of $125,000. And on the west side, that location and the mean income in the zip code of that store was $34,000. That was her local area. The Alamo Heights location offered 95 fruits and vegetables. If you go on their website and see how many they offer, on the west side location, they only offered 4. And so what Linda did was she got so interested in investigating this that she gathered data on the number of organic fruits and vegetables offered at every single H-E-B store in the city of San Antonio. It took her hours to go to every single location's website, filter the data, or filter the results for how many organic fruits and vegetables they had, and then find the average income in the zip code in which that store was located and correlated them, where now the x-axis here on the scatter plot is the average income of the location in the store, and the y-axis is how many organic fruits and vegetables they offered at that location. And we start to investigate this via linear regression. And this is lesson 3.1 on the site. It became not just my own students' exploration, but it became a lesson that now we get to offer to more and more classrooms. And we talk about the problem, we fit a linear regression to it. We talk about the strength of this correlation. We talk about making predictions using our linear regression model. And we say, hey, if we're in a higher income area, how many organic items would you predict versus if you're a lower income area, what is that difference? And then we end up with this discussion question where imagine that a company, not H-E-B, uses a similar model like this one to estimate how many organic items it should put on the shelves purely based on neighborhood income. In your view, is this an unethical use of data? Why or why not? And then we lean on our discussion norms and we get to have this rich conversation about whether this is statistical discrimination or whether this is supply and demand in action. One might argue that using this model is biasing the amount of access that people can get to organic fruits and vegetables. Others might argue that different neighborhoods might have different demand for certain food products, and we're following the data and we're seeing where the demand we need to meet is, and we don't want items to rot on shelves and waste food. And these sides, you end up having a very rich discussion using this data set, and you think about what other data could I gather to try and delineate between what might be going on. So the compelling context here, I think, really is made super compelling by this being local data. And that combined with good questions make for a very compelling context for students because they can relate to the H-E-B in their neighborhood. And creating our own model using the content of linear regression allowed us to think through the ethics of other potential models that might have similar structure and have that rich debate in class. And so again, lesson 3.1, if you want to access it, you'll see the full materials there. I want to close things up by returning to my former student, Julius, whose quote you saw towards the beginning of this session. In April of this year, he published an op-ed in the San Antonio Express News, our main paper here in the city of San Antonio, titled, "What Were the Odds That a Math Class Would Change My Life?" And as an educator, this was probably one of the more meaningful moments of my career, seeing this in print. And I'm simply going to read some of Julius's words from that op-ed to close out our meditation on why relevance is powerful. So he said, growing up on San Antonio's South Side, I had brutal firsthand experience navigating poverty, domestic violence, and drugs within my family. With all that happening in the background, it was hard to focus on the typical high school math courses, geometry, algebra 2, and pre-calculus. These concepts seemed irrelevant to my life. While we were encouraged to go to college for many of us, we would be the first in our families to do so. I had no clue what I wanted to do, and I had little frame of reference. My senior year at Burbank High School in San Antonio ISD, everything changed. At this point in the op-ed, Julius starts talking about enrolling in AP Stats and starting to take the course. Then he says, as AP Stats went on, we learned more skills that helped us see between the lines, bias versus unbiased sampling, correlation versus causation, and significance versus practical importance. All the examples covered real data on topics that mattered to my friends and me. Who was the greatest basketball player of all time? Is becoming an influencer a stable career choice? Does my vote actually matter to election outcomes? I was mesmerized. I went on to earn a top score on the AP statistics exam. I later was accepted into the University of Texas, excuse me, at San Antonio, where I'm currently studying data science and finance. I've completed an internship with the USAA. I'm interning at the Spurs Sports and Entertainment, where he's doing currently business analytics as an intern for the team. As my classmates and I have experienced, saying math is valuable and you'll use it one day isn't the right answer to an important question. And that question is, when are we going to ever use this? We cannot simply be told that math is valuable. Math has to feel valuable. It has to be valuable, not at some point in the vague future after making very specific career choices. It needs to be useful right here, right now, and applicable to the things you care about. If we bring more data on real and important topics into our math classrooms, I'm confident more students will find the same love for math that I did. Achievement gaps will close, and we'll be better equipped to use these valuable skills for the rest of our lives. As you can imagine, Julius was an incredible student and is an incredible human being. It was such a privilege to teach him. I think his words drive home the importance of, as educators, us continuing to make statistics what it already is, and that is relevant. So I hope that we go forth and continue doing it together as a community. Thank you all so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to answering questions.
All right, Dash, we do have some questions in the Q&A. Do you want me to read them to you and then you can? All right. So the first one goes back to the gerrymandering example from Sylvia. It says, does the gerrymandering simulation stick to keeping counties whole as possible in their assignment to congressional districts, which is reasonable since elections are administered by county? It looked like some of the simulated district maps varied quite a bit from county lines. Also, there's a reason behind using geographic features such as mountains and rivers, which impede transportation. If the simulation does not incorporate these constraints, then the likelihood results from the simulation would be misleading, subject to criticism. Would be good to have the simulation as reasonable as possible.
Good. Keep me accountable. I love it. No, it's a wonderful question and a great one. So from my understanding, and much smarter people were behind the back end of this, making the R package that renders the simulations. And so I would defer to their documentation and to their work. But from my understanding, the simulation takes into account a few conditions. One is the laws of the state. Some states have very restrictive laws as to the shapes allowed and the grain size allowed for the districts. And so the simulation will change its renderings based on what the state law is around that. For example, Iowa has to have very geometric shapes in its districts, whereas Texas, that's more anything goes in terms of the shape. And so you'll see differences in the simulation that way. In addition, one thing that is true across all states is that the districts have to have relatively equal population sizes, so that there's a balance of population. So that condition is also built into the maps, and into the simulations. And in terms of like the smallest grain size for where you can draw the lines, I believe that is based on, again, state law. Is it the county level? Is it the voter precinct level? Is it beyond the county level? I think the simulation takes into account what state law says around that, because it is different by state. That said, again, I would look at the package authors documentation, because this is my understanding, but they would have more info, including info on the randomization process and the Monte Carlo sampling they're using. And in terms of like geographic features, that's something that I don't know if they've fully taken into account. But I would look more in the package details to see if it's there.
Awesome. All right. Our second question, another one making you think a little bit here, Dash, from an anonymous person. I'm a storyteller supporter for sure. Devil's advocate question I've received in the past. Is there an applicable sports analogy where players love to play the game but aren't as inspired to do drills, but are more successful because they've done the drills? Does every activity have to be anchored in a compelling story?
It's a great question. I don't think every activity needs to be anchored in a compelling story. I think putting that standard on ourselves would mean we would not be able to sleep at night, because we'd be spending all night finding stories that relate to our content and making these sorts of activities. And I think that's why I kind of have several suggested ways to meet the relevance criteria. And I think a storytelling aspect of them is not completely necessary for every single one, including in sports. And I think, for example, that example provided where you're wondering if doing the drills is making players better, is something that most students are going to understand, because we have an intuitive understanding of that, and could be compelling. And I think it would be, say, enhanced by a story, but I don't think it's like the do or die thing there. So I think there's always a spectrum with these things, and it's like what other tools can we add to our arsenal to really bring it alive for kids? And I don't think that these strategies that I've shared are like, you have to do these or else it's not relevant. It's more just suggestions and tips and tricks.
Perfect. All right. Another anonymous entry. How easy or difficult is it to fit in all the content using the relevant lessons with instruction days dedicated to holidays, performances, assemblies, etc., and still have 2 to 3 to 4 weeks of review time before the AP Stats exam?
So I have every year about 5 to 6 weeks of review time for the AP Stats exam. And I try and use relevant context for every single lesson throughout the year. I think that sometimes when we think about embedding relevance, we can worry about timing. And I think that piece of connected content, where if we're doing it in a way that's really effective, the content is in part driving the context, in part helping students really see into the context, that makes it so that it doesn't really take extra time to do a relevant example, because the content is genuinely connected to the relevance. And so it's just more bang for the same buck of the time in class. The other thing I'll mention is that I think when students feel a genuine sense that the stuff they're learning is important and powerful in their lives, when you go to maybe the not as relevant things where they're getting fluency practice on practice problems, which all of us do and should do because we want students to get fluency in these methods, that might not be as relevant, I've found a bit more motivation to do that work and to do it really well, and also to do it on time, because they understand that developing their skill set in these tools is a genuinely useful activity. And so in that way, it does save some time in on the back end. And so I do also think about, though, like other math courses like Algebra 1, Algebra 2, where unlike stats, one could argue that the content is not as intrinsically connected to relevant examples, but we're actively working on that. And this summer, wink, wink, hint, hint, we're going to release a new version of our algebra materials that really try and bridge that gap, where it's not extra class time, it's just doing the same lessons, but in relevant contexts.
All right. The next question was from Larry Lesser. Do you find students really seem to be deterred about a career as a social influencer, even after seeing the sobering data, if they fixate on a belief in themselves that says they can skew the script and rise above the odds/predictions?
I love you, Larry. By the way, in full transparency, I try and submit as much as I can to the cause web caption contest. I was in awe of Larry's domination of the caption contest. And thank you for the great question. I do think some students want to be the outlier. The point of the lesson is you are seeing the content of the outliers. You're not seeing the content of the majority. But the thing is, outliers exist. They are real. And what I like to tell students is that statistics is the study of trends. It's not the study of individuals necessarily. Some students think I will beat the odds and I will become the individual that is an outlier. And I think, doing this activity still gives them an appreciation for how hard that journey might be and how capricious that success might be, in a way that they wouldn't have had otherwise. So yeah, I think some students still do, but they have an appreciation for what that path might look like now.
All right. And if you know Larry's work in the lottery, you know why he's asking that question too. All right. We have another one from an anonymous person saying, any chance you're going to create a set of lessons about geometry?
It's a good question. Eventually we want to get to the point where we have every high school math and a relevant version of it on the site free to access. Geometry is on our roadmap for being the last bridge to cross in that path. At the moment, that could change. But it is personally for me as a one-year geometry teacher myself, the most intimidating bridge to cross. But I'm excited for the challenge, and I can't give a timeline on it now, but I'm hoping we can do it soon.
All right. And then how often do you create new lessons?
So every summer we launch new stuff on the site. And that might include stuff that replaces the older stuff because it's like a same context, but an improvement. And other times it's like a new context. And we have some lessons where it's like, hey, here's the same lesson, the same content, but a few different contexts that you can choose from based on your student population and what they enjoy the most. And so we try and add as many as we can each summer, along with new courses as often as we can. And we're trying to get better and better at that each year.
All right. What do you typically do for homework? Knock out as many of these as possible in the last 7 minutes.
Yes. So for homework, I don't do anything fancy. Well, let me back up a bit. I actually, before I flipped my classroom, my homework was, hey, odd problems from the textbook, go. And I don't think every problem a student has to do has to be genuinely relevant. I do think that fluency practice to get procedural fluency, to get that more solid understanding, it would be exhausting to try and write, 15 relevant problems for them to work on. And I think students also appreciate having a mix. So to get that fluency, standard bread and butter, here's the odd problems. The thing I do now, though, is I actually flip my classroom. So I have students watch the lesson videos before coming in, and then the lesson videos on Skew Script end with the discussion question, which students ponder on before class on a relevant topic. We start off by discussing that discussion question, and students are hyped because they're like, I have this idea for a discussion question, and my answer to it, I'm ready to share it in class. They've shared it. They have their notes from already watching the video. And then we go straight into practice problems in class. And those are the same odd problems from the textbook, but now they get a chance to work on it together in class rather than doing it at home alone where they might not have the same support. And so that's what I do now.
All right, and then we have a couple of other questions. Have you and your students presented the organic food materials to the HEB management? If so, what was their response?
We have not, and I would love to do so. And from my previous experiences with that company in particular, they seem like a very community-oriented organization. And so I think it would be a fascinating conversation to have. But we haven't made use of the opportunity, but I feel like it'd be a very powerful opportunity, especially for that student, to do that. So I appreciate the suggestion. And I wonder where that conversation would lead and what other factors they might throw into the mix of the discussion question we have at the end, where is this, statistical discrimination, or is this supply and demand? What other factors are they looking at when we see just the data along two variable lines?
All right, I think you had a lot of compliments in the chat, and one sort of like, oh, cool, we could also use the influencer data to talk about skewed distributions and sampling distribution of a mean. But the last question, I think, is sort of asking you to think about that 42%. It says, just to make sure I know how to interpret that number, was the eventual 40+% rate of success reflecting only the school you taught at or San Antonio urban area like the 2%?
Just my school.
All right. Well, I think you answered all of the questions and gave us so many great ideas for how to engage our students in the classroom. So I'll just say in closing, I have posted the link to the Slack channel in the chat. So please join Slack. It's a great place to continue these conversations, share your great ideas. I know I've used a couple of the lessons that Dash shared. So it's a great place to say like, oh, I did this in my college course and it worked really well. And then also, you got a 15-minute break before we head into our first set of breakout sessions. So 15 minutes, and then go find that next Zoom link in your email from Megan. Thank you, Dash.
Thank you so much, everyone. And sorry for all the coughing. I had a little bit of a cold today, but I appreciate your patience. And thank you all for coming to listen. I really appreciate it. I'm honored.
All right. Thanks, everyone.